So I want to thank Tim, and now I want to introduce Gerald Hiddell. We're excited to have him all the way from the UK. He's the director of the MHRA. He's responsible for the quality of medicines in the UK. He started out as a microbiologist. He was in the National Health Agency for the UK for many, many years. And I'm really excited that he's here with us to share his perspective. So let's welcome Gerald.
Well, thank you, Patricia, for that kind welcome, and thank you to Rx-360 for inviting me to be here. It's a delight to be in such a lovely place as California at this time of year, and perhaps the excuse to stay here a bit longer, as I'm supposed to be flying to Washington tomorrow, might be welcome anyway. So thank you for that, and thank you to Amgen for their excellent hospitality for this meeting. Patricia mentioned getting to know people and understand. What she didn't mention is that she's apparently a qualified pilot on 737s, apparently, yes. Okay, so maybe this flight to Washington could be less hazardous than we imagined. So, thank you. Okay. Well, yeah, that's why you're in the pharmaceutical industry, Patricia. It's good. What I want to do just briefly is to set the context of the European Falsified Medicines Directive, and I'll do that quite quickly because I think Martin's been good enough to do that very well already, and then to go on and explain some of the content, an overview of the content of the European Falsified Medicines Directive, and some of the issues surrounding its implementation. But perhaps I could ask firstly, your companies, I assume that many of you are supplying or doing business in Europe. Perhaps I could have a show of hands. Okay, so I shouldn't feel too awkward about speaking to a US audience on a European issue, because this obviously is of interest and concern to you. The issue of counterfeit medical products is something that is in the press almost on a weekly basis, and something which you will all be very aware of. A review that I've done over the last year or two on press accounts of counterfeiting worldwide really illustrates the fact that there's no continent, there's no country that isn't faced with this threat of fake medicines. The distribution of those medicines, it was often thought, I think, that counterfeit medicines were confined to lifestyle-type products, the products for erectile dysfunction, for hair loss, slimming, and so on. But it's clear that an examination of reports indicates that far more serious and life-saving drugs are incorporated, and we've had the illustration today of Avastin already. But the interesting thing is, if you look at this worldwide, the distribution from different parts of the world is different. In Europe, for instance, yes, there is still a major part played by erectile dysfunction drugs, although you'll see there are other products as well. Now, I looked at the US equivalent, and I have to say the data was more limited, so I haven't put it as a pie chart. But you can be assured that this European picture is very similar in the US, in that lifestyle-type drugs are still high on the agenda. Erectile dysfunction drugs for slimming, and believe it or not, Botox are key areas for counterfeiting in the US. But if you move to other parts of the world, you see quite a different picture. In Asia, for instance, horrifically, antibiotics, antimalarials, vaccines are targets for counterfeiters. And you can only begin to imagine the devastating effect of any of these products, not only being harmful, but just not being effective, the devastating effect that would have. And the same is true in Africa. This was a rather more limited database, so it doesn't cover all areas. But again, you see the picture, antibiotics, antimalarials, and emerging here, contraceptives that are being counterfeited. And again, you can only begin to imagine the effect of that. We've already seen Mr. Leroy Hubley, who is this gentleman, and his case has been explained to us. And as Martin said, this in many ways triggered not only the formation of Rx-360, which I'm again delighted to say I'm able to support because of the excellent work you do on supply chain security, trying to get safe and effective medicines to patients. But not only that, it was also, I think, particularly material in triggering the European Falsified Medicines Directive, which I'm going on to explain. And there were some very obvious lessons. There may be others, but clearly it became obvious that we had insufficient knowledge of the supply chain, where our products came from, where the ingredients for those products were sourced. And that needed to be improved. We similarly needed to understand the risk associated with that supply chain so that we might manage it effectively. It was clear also that the specifications for some products are maybe not adequate, although quite honestly I think it would be difficult for anybody to have easily anticipated the presence of chondroitin sulfate in heparin. But it was clear also that there needed to be a greater involvement with suppliers. And the European Medicines Directive sought to address, Falsified Medicines Directive sought to address that. There are clearly some risks associated with fake medicines, and I don't think any of you here need to be reminded of those risks. The risk that the product itself may not contain what it is intended to contain, and therefore would not be effective. The risk that it may contain contaminants, or it may be deliberately adulterated, and therefore would be positively harmful to the patient. Patients, consumers of medicinal products have the right to have confidence in those products. Their doctor has made a prescription, the pharmacist dispenses that prescription, they have the right to expect precisely what was intended. And nothing undermines their confidence more quickly than the suspicion that that product might be fake. And there have clearly been cases that have been referred to already today of serious consequences of that falsification. But for your companies as well, not only is there the primary concern which you share with regulators and with others, that patients would be harmed by falsified products, there's also clearly a damage to one of your greatest assets in the pharmaceutical industry, which is your reputation, and also the bottom line of your company, financial impact of counterfeits. So it was that in 2011, the Falsified Medicines Directive was enacted, and it has been progressively introduced since the beginning of last year, since 2013. And there are still aspects which I will describe which still have to be completed in the next few years. Put simply, the Falsified Medicines Directive has a number of components, and I want to just quickly walk you through these key components. Firstly, in relation to active substances, the driver really is that whether it's manufactured, whether it's imported, and whether it's distributed in Europe, that it effectively is to an equivalent standard, that it must comply as appropriate with standards of good manufacturing practice and standards of good distribution practice. That, and we've already mentioned the excellent work that Rx-360 is doing, that audits should be, physical audits should be conducted of suppliers of active substances. Now, the MHRA has required that for some years. That has been our interpretation of the existing legislation, but it's now made even clearer in European legislation, either by yourself or, as we've already mentioned, by a third-party contractor doing the audits for you. with active substances, there's a baseline requirement, and the first requirement, which is meant to be the normal requirement for most active substances, is that there should be a written confirmation from the regulators in the country from which the active substance is sourced. A written confirmation that the manufacturer has operated to an equivalent standard of good manufacturing practices. So that's the basic requirement. But there are a couple of waivers. The first waiver is that the country as a whole has been assessed by the European Commission and has been determined to be operating to an equivalent standard of good manufacturing practices for active substances. And they have a system in place to oversee that operation and processes to report where there are excursions from that good practice. And the second waiver, which was really meant to be exceptional, and I emphasize that, exceptional, where the product is particularly needed medically, clinically, a waiver which actually is provided by the fact that the site in question has been inspected by a European member state authority and has been issued a GMP certificate. So, as we approached July last year, a number of us, me included, had some real trepidations. What faced us? Were we approaching the end of the world as we know it with respect to active substances? Was there suddenly going to be no medicine because people couldn't source their active substances? And some of your companies must have been asking exactly that same question. Well, my view is that it probably wasn't quite as serious as that, but there was certainly a bomb which was ignited. And unless we did some really fancy footwork to try to defuse that bomb, then there could have been major supply shortages for active substances after July the 2nd. So it was that my own agency, the MHRA, initiated a review across the then 27 member states in Europe, and we sought information which we then validated as to where the active substances were being sourced. And that review uncovered the fact that there were some 1,600 active substances which were in marketing authorizations or product licenses in Europe, and they were sourced from over 40 countries worldwide. And what's interesting, of course, is that 85% of them or so are coming from 5 key countries, which is India, China, US, Japan, and Switzerland. They are the main suppliers of active substances. The key questions that we addressed as we approached July last year were, would the source countries issue the written confirmations? What source countries would be whitelisted, would be put on the EU list of acceptability? And for those exceptional medical needs, what would be the requirement for inspections, and could it be met? And I guess the bottom line is, would there be disruptions to supply? Well, with respect to written confirmations, this is an updated list that's now current. Over 70% of the countries that supply the active substances to Europe are now issuing written confirmations, which is really excellent news. And of the remainder, 26% are actually from countries, from countries that have been whitelisted, including the US. And 2 other countries are being considered at the moment and are in the process of assessment, namely Brazil and Singapore. So you see that 98% plus of active substances can still legitimately be supplied to Europe from countries outside Europe. That's the case, and so that bomb was effectively diffused. The second waiver I mentioned, which was the inspection waiver, was where there is no written confirmation, where the country isn't whitelisted, where the product is needed medically, and a GMP certificate would allow that waiver to be put in place. But perhaps it's worth explaining that in Europe, unlike the US, there is no mandatory requirement to inspect the active substance suppliers outside Europe. There is no mandatory requirement, and the agencies are not set up to do that. They're set up to do a number of obvious things, like the oversight of finished products, the oversight of these active substances suppliers on their own territory, and the inspection of manufacturers on a risk-based basis for active substances in third countries. So there was no provision for that. But what we did following July was to set up what you could call a rapid reaction team who had a telephone conference every Friday and looked at whether there was a need to pull out all the stops and send an inspector quickly overseas to avoid a shortage situation. Now, it hardly ever happened. A handful of cases only required such a response, which surprised me, frankly, and pleased me as well. So moving on from active substances quickly, another requirement was around excipients, which is new to the Falsified Medicines Directive, new in European law, that there should be an appropriate GMP. Well, we hadn't got one in Europe, so a subgroup of the Inspectors Working Party, which is a cross-European group, met to establish GMPs for excipients. They worked hard on that. The consultation has taken place. They finalised their document at the end of last year. It's now gone to the European Commission, and I would expect, certainly this side of Easter, for the European Commission to agree that document, and in which case it would be published within 6 months. So in reality, my best guess is that come September, October, there will be published European GMPs on excipients. Because of time, I won't go into the detail of this. Another part of the jigsaw was bringing new players in the supply chain into the regulatory arena, onto our radar, as it were. Wholesale dealers had already been there. They already have to be licensed in Europe. But a new requirement would be that they were listed on a cross-European database, and that they would be subject to good distribution practices. And that they would be, and this is quite important, Martin mentioned the concept of something being too good to be true. Well, if they're offered a deal that's too good to be true, they are legally obliged now to report that suspicion to their national regulator. One other player that has not previously been under the radar are those people who manage deals but don't actually handle products, so-called brokers. Now, they are now being registered. They have a requirement to do that, and they have obligations that are not that dissimilar from those of wholesale distributors. So, as far as these actors in the supply chain is concerned, whether it's a manufacturer, an importer, or a distributor, they need to be registered. They need to apply, where appropriately, to GMP and to GDP for active substances. Moving on to the third piece in our jigsaw, we've already mentioned again, if you want to obtain a counterfeit medicine, then the way to do it is to buy it on the internet. Absolutely. Your chances of doing so, and I can't speak for the United States, but I assume it's true, certainly in the UK, your chances of doing so across the pharmacy counter are remote in the extreme. That would be our experience and our position. That doesn't mean we're complacent. It doesn't mean it won't become a bigger problem, but at this point in time, it's pretty safe, the legitimate supply chain. On the internet, there are legitimate, within Europe, there are legitimate registered pharmacies. And if a patient is seeking to use one of those pharmacies, they need to know whether it's legitimate. And the logo is meant to be a means by which they can relate to a national database to determine whether or not that pharmacy is legitimate. And this, I'm pleased to tell you, is the European Commission's choice of logo. I don't want anybody to comment on whether they think it's a good choice or a bad one, but that's the choice of logo. The UK for some years just had a green cross, which seemed quite simple and straightforward to me, but this is the Commission's choice. The final part in the jigsaw, safety features. Until now, there's been no European rules on safety features. These rules cover two main areas, one which is tamper evidence, and the other which is some system of serialization and tracing of product. They will apply in European law primarily to prescription-only products and to non-prescription products where there is thought to be a particular high risk. I mean, an obvious example, if it was delisted to be a non-prescription product, which may be the case, would be a product like Viagra, which is a clear target for counterfeit. And if that ever became an over-the-counter product, then I guess it would be one of these exceptions. The requirement is that there be some unique identifier on individual packs. How is this going to shape up? Well, it's what's called a Delegated Act. So what that means in European law is that when the original directive was issued, it wasn't determined exactly the detail. And the responsibility lies with the European Commission, after various consultations and discussions, to come up with the detail. Now, they had those consultations and discussions the year before last. Last year, they undertook a detailed impact assessment, and this is the outcome of the impact assessment. So this is what is likely to happen as a result of the deliberations within the European Commission, although they will have to confirm that by the end of this year. Essentially, they have agreed that on the composition of the number, likely to be a 2D barcode, will contain a serialization, will contain things like the product name, batch number, expiry date. For certain countries, there may be reimbursement details that are included in that barcode, but that needs to be agreed. Secondly, that there will be a pack-specific recognition of products at the point of dispensing, and also there's likely to be some form of verification at wholesale dealers. And thirdly, that individual member states will be responsible for making sure that the information is available to actually verify those specific packs. So you heard it here. This is what I think the Commission is going to do, but they haven't published that. Now you're recording this, so that puts me in a very invidious position, doesn't it, really? But let's take a risk on it. This is, I think, is where we're going. There is still some dispute, there are still some issues, and frankly, major concerns about how we can implement this effectively. It isn't simple, it's very complex with different dispensing practices across different European countries. So I wouldn't underestimate the issue, nor is it straightforward for generic companies in particular, where cost is a premium, and this will inevitably add cost to products. So there are some significant issues yet to be worked through with respect to this safety feature issue. I think this is my last slide. Just by conclusion, there are good and bad parts of the Falsified Medicines Directive. A lot of it actually came from a review that my own agency did in 2007 on looking at the whole supply chain in the context of a number of counterfeit incidents that we had faced. So I'm very pleased to see it in place. I think it adds further protection against fake medicines. The implementation is surprisingly largely on track. Shortages for products, for instance, from active substances, availability has been averted, I'm pleased to say. The so-called whitelisting is continuing. There is, I think, a need to be more confident in written confirmations from certain countries. As you may well be aware, there are questions being raised about products from certain countries and whether or not the written confirmations are really of value. But nonetheless, it's moving towards a situation where there is an equivalence globally, and it's pushing those countries towards that equivalence, which is actually a really helpful move. There are key decisions to be made, as I mentioned, on security features and tracking, which should come during this year, and also that internet logo. I think the decision has virtually been made, but it has to be implemented. I should say on the security features, once it's published this year, there will be 3 years for countries to implement, or in the case of countries that have already got something in place, up to 6 years. So there's a time to get this sorted out. But it moves us towards a global standard. And one final comment, which I make particularly to a US audience who may not be so familiar with this, the role of a qualified person in Europe remains paramount. This individual is named on the product license, on the marketing authorization, and they have a responsibility for making sure that products that are released to market have been manufactured in accordance with GMP, and that includes a verification of the supply chain, and also that they've been manufactured in accordance with the agreement, the content of the marketing authorization or the product license. So that QP's role is not diminished by anything that the Falsified Medicines Directive has introduced. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald.